So I'm talking today about the regulation of autonomous weapon systems. And by that, I mean military weapon systems like missiles, aircraft, tanks, ships, whatever form they might take, which are controlled not manually by human beings, but by advanced software systems built into the weapon itself that enables those weapons to be deployed on an operation and then do things like search for targets, assess whether circumstances are right to attack those targets, and carry out an attack on their own without necessarily needing a human being to be involved every step of the way. Now, weapon systems that can operate on their own like that potentially offer a lot of advantages to armed forces. They can be faster and more accurate than weapons that are constrained by human capabilities. They give access to extra capabilities like persistent surveillance and advanced data processing, systems that can collect a lot of information about what's happening on the battlefield. They provide superior force protection, so they help a country keep its own soldiers out of the harm's way, potentially financial savings, and so on. So there are quite a few countries around the world that are researching and funding development of these weapons. Many universities and commercial operations are working on the component technologies and answering various questions associated with this. And while we're still in the very early days, we're already seeing increasing degrees of autonomous capability gradually entering weapon systems which are in service with armed forces. Now, alongside that technical development, we're also seeing the debate about whether this is acceptable, whether autonomous weapons should be permitted, should they be banned, should they be subject to some sort of special regulation. Obviously, the idea that a weapon can be sent out to possibly select and attack a target without a human being necessarily being in a position to intervene in that attack can spark concerns. And the public debate about regulating autonomous weapons took off maybe 12, 15 years ago at this point, when various authors began publishing books and papers questioning where this technology is heading, what effect it might be having on armed conflict, and so forth. And for the past 7 years or so, the United Nations has been hosting meetings in which states parties to the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons have been discussing how to respond to the growth of autonomous weapons, looking at questions that arise under the various relevant bodies of law, as well as ethical questions, international security type questions, and so forth. And unfortunately, those meetings have suffered from very, very slow progress. There's been a general failure among the participants to agree on even very basic concepts like what is autonomy in the context of weapon systems. What does the word mean? How autonomous does a weapon need to be to raise concerns? What sort of uses are acceptable, what aren't, and things like that. So for my PhD work, and now in this book, I decided to look at a few of the questions that were causing trouble in those UN discussions and see if I could come up with some suggestions. And I'll talk about part of that work today. I'm not going to go into much detail about IHL matters. I'll be focusing more on autonomy and law in general, looking at the interface between those two and generally why autonomy matters from a legal perspective. All right, so two general topics. First, what are autonomous weapons? And then what makes them worthy of a legal discussion? So first, what are autonomous weapons? Although we're talking today just about weapon systems in particular, the matter of what makes them autonomous is really applicable more broadly to machines in general. There's nothing in the technologies that make a machine autonomous that really differs between weapons and other types of machines like driverless cars and so forth. So at least a part of this discussion is applicable to areas beyond just IHL. Now, one of the challenges that participants in the regulatory debate have encountered is simply in understanding what autonomy means in the context of a machine. A lot of the people involved in those discussions, of course, are lawyers, ethicists, who are accustomed to using fairly stringent definitions of autonomy. They use the word in the sense of a system that can define and pursue its own goals, resist outside influence, and so on. And those notions have found their way into the debate at various points, and they've caused quite some confusion because that's not what machine autonomy is about. In the context of weapon systems, other machines, autonomous is a term that was not chosen by lawyers, it was chosen by scientists and engineers to describe the defining quality of the systems that they've been developing. That being simply an ability for the machine to perform its assigned task without needing instructions or interaction with a human being on an ongoing basis. So autonomous simply means whatever the machine is designed to do, it can do that without necessarily needing a human to guide it every step of the way. And the details of how that is achieved are very complex, and they can vary a lot depending on the nature of the machine and what it's designed to do. But I have put together a couple of simple high-level diagrams that show on a conceptual level the differences between manually operated and autonomous weapons. So this first one is a picture of a manually operated weapon system. It has three main components: the soldier, the weapon, and the target, and the arrows running between them show the relationships between those three parts. So the soldier operates the weapon then fires on the target, and the soldier monitors what's happening to the target and other information from the environment. And the critical point to note in that diagram is just that the soldier is the critical element. The soldier issues all commands to the weapon, monitors what's happening, updates commands to the weapon as needed, and so forth. Compare that to a diagram of an autonomous weapon system, same three basic components, but this time the weapon system includes two parts, a control system as well as a weapon itself. And the critical point to note here is that in this case, it's the autonomous control system within the weapon system that is the critical element. The operator will issue some high-level command to activate the weapon system, to give it a goal. But from then on, it's the control system that takes over, activating the weapon, monitoring the effect on the target, monitoring other information from the environment, and reporting back to the operator at some point. So what's happening is the autonomous weapons control system steps into the shoes of the human operator in respect to whatever functions of the machine have been made autonomous. And what that means for legal purposes is that autonomy is a characteristic that operates primarily on the relationship between a machine and its operator. It doesn't necessarily affect what a machine does, how it behaves, how well it performs its task. It only affects how the operator interacts with the machine. Now that control system is basically just a special purpose computer. It's running software written by weapon system developers, which manages the weapon, responds to new information, does whatever needs to be done. But it is just essentially a special purpose computer, not fundamentally different from a laptop, from any other computer. And it's important to remember that, because the other problematic idea that has entered the regulatory debate from time to time is the idea that autonomous weapons somehow exclude human control, that they act as independent decision-making entities that formulate their own goals and can't be interfered with from outside. And that's not correct. Autonomous machines run on software, and software, of course, is just sets of human-written instructions that describe how to perform some task. So autonomy is not correctly to be seen as the absence of human control, as it's sometimes presented. It is, in fact, a form of control in itself. It's control applied in advance rather than in real time, but still a form of human control. And all the behaviours of an autonomous machine are defined by that control system software. All the details of the task to be done and how it's to be done need to be encoded at some point by humans in the control system and are then simply executed by the machine. So autonomous machines aren't independent in any sense which severs their link to a responsible human. They're not independent in any way that matters for legal purposes. They're still to be regarded just as machines controlled by humans. It's also worth noting that autonomy is a matter of degree. When we say a weapon's autonomous, we don't necessarily mean it always operates entirely by itself. Autonomous weapons might only be able to do certain parts of their job, or in certain circumstances with no human assistance, or even operate just with less human assistance than a manual system would need. They can vary a lot in their degree of complexity. It's been argued that many existing devices, many devices that have existed for decades, can be seen as autonomous. Think of something as simple as a landmine. Once it's in place, it can respond to pressure from a potential target and explode or not without needing any further instructions from an operator. And it technically fits the definition of an autonomous weapon in that sense. Of course, most of the legal interest is in behaviours at the more complex end of the spectrum, where there's more of a sense that perhaps the machine might be behaving in ways which its operator may not have precisely foreseen, responding to events that happen on the battlefield after it's been deployed, which would certainly be the case with the types of systems that are under development at the moment. But it doesn't change the fact that all of an autonomous machine's behaviour is in fact ultimately due to its human-written control software. So that's roughly what autonomous weapons are. Now, what makes them worthy of legal discussion? So basically, the technical change that defines an autonomous system is that it has a set of self-governance capabilities incorporated into it. And that consequently changes the types of decisions and actions that are required of the personnel who are in charge of operating that system. Specifically, it means that certain decisions, which might otherwise have been made by weapon system operators or their commanders during an operation, are instead encoded in software within the weapon system itself. And the actions that might flow on from the making of those decisions are managed by that software, by the machine, rather than manually by a human. So where those decisions and actions are the subject of legal regulation, as many of them are since they concern the use of weapons, it's necessary to ask whether this new way of doing things is still compatible with existing legal rules and what limitations armed forces might need to keep in mind when they're employing autonomous systems. And in that respect, there's quite a range of issues to consider. I'll just touch on a couple of those now. So one general matter is that the nature of decisions necessarily changes when they're encoded in software and they become part of a weapon system rather than being made by an operator live during an armed conflict. An example of that might be that some part of the process of or the criteria for assessing whether a target is one that needs to be attacked during an operation could be encoded into a weapon system. Whatever part of that decision process is encoded in software will be installed in all weapons of that particular type rather than being made by a soldier in the field, so it becomes more general. It takes on the nature of a policy decision rather than just one of multiple individual decisions that are made in respect of specific situations. So the algorithm defining that decision process becomes part of the behaviour of a weapon system, and that process, that part of the process, will then be followed in the same way each time that code's executed in the same environment. It also means the informational basis of encoded decisions is altered. When a decision process is represented in software in a control system, that programming is done obviously in advance of the situation arising on the battlefield. It's done at the time the weapon system is manufactured, when it's configured for a specific type of use. And so it can't be based on direct human observation of the situation to which it ultimately relates. Instead, it must be based on whatever information is available through experience and foresight at the time the control system software is being written and configured. Now, given that the legal framework governing the attack doesn't change just because the technology and use is changing, then those updated capabilities need to be reflected in some updated targeting processes followed by the force operating the autonomous weapon. They need to be sure that they're still meeting their obligations to ensure that targets are attacked in compliance with the law. And so they need to be sure that their processes are compatible with the new ways of operating weapon systems that have some autonomous capability. Another matter that needs to be considered is that different legal rules might apply to specific aspects of an operation where decisions are being delegated to an autonomous system. So broadly, IHL defines two sets of rules relating to weapons. The first set is commonly known as weapons law. It deals with the nature and design of weapon systems, their innate behaviour, the types of effects they have on people and objects. And the burden of ensuring that weapons abide by those rules of weapons law falls primarily on the people who design and develop weapons, the people who review them and procure them for particular purposes. And the second set of rules is known as targeting law, and that deals with how weapon systems are used in conflict and how operators of a weapon system need to behave in the course of planning and conducting an attack in order to satisfy all their legal obligations. And the responsibility for that, of course, falls on attack planners, weapon system operators, their commanders, and so forth, and others involved in conducting the attacks. So, for example, the principle of distinction is one of the fundamental principles of IHL. It states that attacks should only ever be directed against combatants and military targets, never against civilians and civilian objects. And to achieve that, it relies on a number of specific rules that fall within both the weapons law and targeting law groups. The weapons law aspect of distinction requires that a weapon be capable of being directed against a specific military target in the context of the type of the attack that it's intended to be used in, and a weapons review needs to be conducted to establish that that requirement's been met before the weapon's put into service. The targeting law aspect of distinction requires that the people in charge of planning and conducting attacks need to take all feasible precautions when they're selecting weapons, when they're planning attacks, conducting the attacks, to ensure that civilian targets aren't attacked and any incidental civilian harm is minimised. So say, for instance, a piloted aircraft is flying over some area and it's tasked with attacking a target. It would generally be the responsibility of either the pilot or the person who ordered the attack, the person who identified the target, under the rules of targeting law, to ensure that that target being attacked is legitimate, that is military in nature and can legally be attacked. On the other hand, a hypothetical autonomous aircraft in the same situation might only require that an operator select some parameters like a target profile, a search area, perhaps a mission start time, with all subsequent decisions after the launch being handled by the aircraft's control system. Now, in that case, the rules of targeting law might apply to a restricted set of decisions in that process. It might only apply to the decision to use that particular weapon system in that time and place, in light of whatever knowledge is available about the battlefield, about military and civilian activity in the area, and about how the aircraft would normally behave in those conditions. The actual behaviour of the aircraft and its control system when it's operating without a human pilot on board would then be a matter of weapons law. So different rules would apply to different decisions in that attack process, depending on the level of autonomy present in the weapon system. So generally, understanding the IHL status of a particular autonomous technology is an interpretive exercise. Existing law doesn't expressly forbid autonomous weapons. It doesn't even mention them explicitly, or arguably even contemplate machines that behave in that way. And current practices indicate that at least some degree of autonomous operation is acceptable. Weapons that are able to operate unattended in various ways have been used for decades in carefully controlled circumstances. Nobody seriously claims that their use is or should be illegal due to their ability to operate unattended. But the question is where the limits might be and how higher degrees of autonomy can be incorporated into military operations, and where the limits might be within the existing law. It's a matter of interpreting existing rules. The arguments that are sometimes made to the effect that autonomy in weapons necessarily violates IHL requirements, that it can't be accommodated within existing legal frameworks, tend to often be based on conceptions of autonomous machines which are unsustainable. You often hear about anthropomorphic conceptions of autonomous machines that make their own decisions, that select targets on their own without reference to the place of that weapon within the military hierarchy and the human involvement that's needed around the edges of an operation, even where an autonomous weapon is used. When we start the analysis from a clear understanding of what makes a weapon system autonomous, views that they're somehow special or fundamentally different or can't be incorporated within the legal framework tend to fall apart. Autonomous weapons not being specifically mentioned in existing IHL, they're subject to the same legal framework. They can be managed under the same rules, provided that we're able to interpret those rules correctly to account for weapons that take over some tasks that the law perhaps assumes would be done by humans. And that's essentially what I have to share with you today.